Climate-smart agriculture is an approach that addresses the challenges of enhancing agriculture productivity, adapting to climate change, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It involves adopting practices and technologies that increase resilience to a changing climate, such as droughts or floods, while also contributing to mitigation efforts by reducing the carbon emissions from farming activities. Integrating climate-smart agriculture practices can help ensure food security, abate the effects of carbon, and promote the sustainable agriculture practices for the long-term well-being of both farmers and the environment. As Congress considers the Farm Bill next year, this conversation is particularly salient, and WGA is very involved in the Farm Bill advocacy on behalf of the governors. So here to lead this important discussion on climate-smart agriculture is Kristen Boysen, who serves as the Managing Director of the Colorado Department of Agriculture's Drought and Climate Office. Kristen, all yours.
Thanks, Zach. Hi all, my name is Kristen Boysen. I'm here from Colorado. Thanks for having us here in beautiful Idaho. Happy to be here. I will say I was born in Nampa, and I told my parents I was coming for 24 hours today, and they're like, you should rent a car and go see your home you lived 4 years in. But I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna hang out with you nice people instead. So as Zach said, or excuse me.
Sorry, I've been called worse.
Sorry, Jack. As Jack said, I'm the Managing Director of the Colorado Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Drought and Climate Resilience Office, or ADCRO for short. This is a new office, started in 2021, and I'm the first employee, and now we have like 7 employees. Our office includes our energy program, which includes both grants for on-farm renewable energy and energy efficiency projects, as well as our agrivoltaics research and development grants, which are trying to co-locate solar panels on working ag lands. I also lead our state and federal climate policy negotiations, making sure that ag communities are at the table. And then importantly, perhaps most important for today, I also oversee our soil health program, which has been going on for about 4 years now to great success. So before I let Myles and Bill introduce themselves, I was asked to give kind of a little bit of an overview of greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. And the whole point of this panel is that ag is one of the few industries, ag and forestry, that can be carbon neutral. We have some emissions, but we also have great potential to capture carbon, to sequester carbon through good operations. In Colorado, we're in the middle of doing our greenhouse gas inventory update, which I'm only partially involved in. But ag is a little tricky because it's separated across several different categories that is like kind of standard practice for counting. First is the land use change category. In the West and in the United States, that's converting. We lose carbon if we convert rangeland and forests and croplands into higher use things like suburban development, and we gain carbon if we convert things back into working lands. That latter thing doesn't happen that often. We see much more loss of natural and working lands than gain. All farm equipment is either counted in industrial or in the transportation sector, so that's a little bit hard to capture. But if you're doing on-farm, you're running your diesel tractor, or you have a hot water heater for your dairy, that's captured somewhere else. But the agricultural sector of our inventory includes livestock management, soil management, and then some other more minimal things like urea fertilizer use and field burning. But those things are so small in the West and in Colorado, they're hardly counted. The biggest section is that livestock emissions, livestock management, and that includes enteric emissions and manure management. We just heard a lot about manure management. In Colorado, that makes up about 55%, or just over half, of our total ag emissions. The soil management is mostly around fertilizer use and nitrous oxide emissions, and that's slightly less than half. And ag in Colorado makes up 10% of our total emissions. This number is actually going up. Unlike other industries, it's has increased about 20% from our baseline year of 2005. And that's mostly because of increased population in the country and the world and increased demand for meat. So there's just more cows around. These numbers are very uncertain. They're based on state modeling and national modeling. And there's a lot of room for improvement, especially in the ag sector around greenhouse gas emission calculations. So people estimate it's like plus or minus 18%. So it can really vary year to year. And it's like pretty basic information that goes into the models. It's like number of working dairies, number of cows in the state, acres of corn. So in Colorado, we're really focused on understanding our natural and working lands emissions, and then excitingly focused on that capture and sequestration component. How can we incentivize improved management to capture that carbon in our soils? So with that, I'll turn it over to Myles for a quick introduction.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. I am Myles Gray. I'm the Program Director for the United States Biochar Initiative. USBI is a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing the production and use of biochar in the United States. I'm sure many of you are not familiar with what biochar actually is, so I'll just tell you. It's essentially a form of charcoal that is produced from biomass that's not burned. So as long as you don't burn that material, the carbon that's in biochar ends up being sequestered for something like 500 years or more. It's very resistant to microbial decay in the environment, including in soils. And that material, that charcoal-like material, biochar, is about 90% carbon. And so a lot of the biochar industry to date has been thinking about biochar as a soil amendment. And of course, that's why, what we're talking about in this space here. So as a soil amendment, adding biochar to soil, and you're typically adding sort of 1 to 10 tons per acre is typically kind of the application rate. So it's a pretty high application rate, similar to lime. It sequesters that carbon in soil for hundreds to thousands of years. So you've added some carbon to the soil that improves soil health. That carbon improves general soil health, microbial populations, and things like that. But then there are a bunch of other co-benefits to adding biochar to soil, things like increasing water holding capacity. So it can increase water holding capacity and reduce, and also increase water use efficiency, potentially driving down irrigation costs. It increases nitrogen use efficiency and also nitrogen holding. So it can also reduce leaching of nitrate to groundwater. And then another benefit is that the presence of biochar, of this carbon in the soil, actually helps increase the accumulation rate of other types of soil organic matter. It can help protect a lot of natural organic matter and natural carbon that's produced by things like plant roots and microbes. Those get attached to pieces of biochar and they get physically protected from degradation. So it can sort of enhance the accumulation of other organic matter in soils. So that's kind of biochar within the context of agriculture, but I just want to go a little bit higher level here for a minute and talk about more broadly the concept of biochar and its context in the West. So really, when I think about biochar, the whole idea is a way to improve management of waste biomass materials. And when I say waste biomass, I'm talking about almost any type of biomass. So things like sawmill residues, slash piles in the woods, agricultural field residues, agricultural processing wastes. It can be things like construction debris, as long as it's clean enough to be primarily wood, compost overs, digestate, manure, and even things like biosolids from wastewater treatment plants. So you can convert pretty much any of this material into biochar. And the process is essentially you take that biomass, you heat it without oxygen to about 500 or 600 degrees Celsius, and because there's no oxygen, basically a whole bunch of vapors are released, and those combustible vapors are removed, and you're left with biochar, very similar to charcoal. And really the way you're sort of increasing the value of that waste is via producing biochar, you produce that physical biochar product, which has benefits in soil and in other things. You can also, right now, sell a very high value, high durability carbon credit through the voluntary carbon markets. These are quite high value. They're currently trading at about $130 per ton of CO2e for a biochar related carbon removal credit. And then the third angle here is that those combustible vapors, those have value too. They are oftentimes called pi gases, producer gases, or syngas. Those are sort of similar names or names for similar things. That can be used to produce heat or electricity, so it can just be combusted on site to produce heat or electricity, but you can also use that material to create biofuels, and also there are pathways to fraction that into some amount of hydrogen. And so in the context of the West, we have abundant sources of waste biomass, particularly in the agricultural and timber industries. And I just want to point out one piece with respect to the timber industry is, as we're facing increased fire risk across the West, there's a real push to incentivize these large-scale fuel reduction treatments on vast acreages of land. And it's extremely expensive. And there's a real potential that producing biochar, particularly using these small mobile units that you can bring out to the woods, that there's a way to help add some revenue to those projects to sort of help offset some of the cost of those large-scale treatment projects. And I'll say one bit more that, we're here talking about biochar as a soil amendment, but there's a lot of other uses for this material. Some of them include using it as a building material, using it in concrete and asphalt. Also as a replacement for something called carbon black, which is a material that is ubiquitous. It's all around us. Almost everything that you see in this room that's black probably has carbon black in it, and it's half of your tire is carbon black. That's a petroleum-based material that can be replaced with biomass-derived charcoal. And there are other uses as well. So in addition to the production of biochar being a way to remove carbon from the atmosphere, there are ways to use this material to decarbonize supply chains.
Thanks, Myles. Bill, introduce yourself.
Great. Bill Jaeger. Excited to be here. I work in an organization called the Lohr Foundation. We are a private charitable family foundation that's focused on quality of life in the Mountain West. And so our grant making is heavily focused in 5 states, New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. And we have a community-driven approach. So the bulk of our grant making is done by community members, community officers who are from and live in the communities where we do our grant making, which are rural communities in each of those states. So in New Mexico, it's Taos and Cuesta. In Colorado, it's Cortez and Monte Vista, Lander, Wyoming, Libby, Montana, and Weiser here in Idaho. And we also have the opportunity to look at regional issues and do our grant making around that. Our sort of commitment is not sector specific. We're a foundation that's focused on quality of life. And so that's defined truly by the community members who bring forward their ideas. And so that covers a wide array of issues, health, housing, education, the economy, civic engagement, transportation, water, the environment. So broad range of issues. And we really try to operate in a people-driven approach. We're on the search for innovative, people-driven ideas to address challenges we're facing here in the West, and particularly the rural Mountain West. This year alone, we'll fund upwards, I would guess, of about 400 community-driven solutions that come directly from community members. And on top of that, we also have that opportunity to look at regional issues. As you might imagine, the rural communities where we work are heavily reliant on the success of our agricultural communities. And so knowing that and taking our approach that's truly listen first to what the community is bringing forward and trying to tap into those regional issues, we launched an initiative last year that we called Fieldwork. It was an effort to source innovative ideas directly from farmers and ranchers throughout the Mountain West to address any water-related challenge they might have been looking at. And so too often these conversations around systems and policy, the future of the Colorado River, the future of water in the West feel disconnected from the lived experience of those farmers and ranchers who are on the front lines, who will be most directly impacted around the future of water in our communities. And so we said, how do we make it easier for farmers and ranchers to get money in their pocket to try out innovative ideas? And so we launched an initiative where we sourced those innovative ideas last year, and this year funded 61 projects across the Mountain West. We had more than 260 ideas proposed. And I'm sure you're wondering, how did I end up on this panel talking about quality of life in small mountain towns? And what was interesting is that amongst the solutions that people brought forward related to their water related challenges, producers, we saw an abundance of soil health ideas brought forward. And so we've had the opportunity over the course of the past year to partner directly with farmers and ranchers around the challenges they're facing, the opportunities that they see, and the role of soil health in addressing their water-related challenges. We also know when we are supporting producers and using incentive-based approaches, voluntary ideas that they want to bring forward, that we see many spillover benefits. And so as we get through a number of the topics we're going to address today, eager to talk about the producer and water-related benefits of a number of the strategies that also have a carbon sequestration and carbon benefit when we get into the soil health pieces.
Thanks, Bill. I'll start us off pretty broadly here, and maybe, Bill, this will be a good segue from your intro. Why do we have this panel today? Why should we focus on ag as a component of carbon sequestration, given all the many options we have?
I'm happy to start. Kristen's in the odd position of being the most knowledgeable moderator of any panel, where she has a lot of the specific statistics and knowledge on the impact of, or the role of agriculture in addressing carbon-related issues. So hopefully you'll very quickly answer your own questions and correct the things I say wrong. So specifically, we know that agricultural producers, again, are on the front lines of the challenges related to water, soil health, productivity, in a really challenging set of conditions here in the Mountain West. And as I noted, one of the things that is really hard as a producer is to change practice. There's so much risk involved in a tight margin sector, where when we ask producers to take on to address an issue related to, hey, be part of the conversation around addressing carbon, or be part of the solution around addressing climate-related issues. We're also asking people to take a risk with their livelihood and to think about changes in practice. And so initiatives like the ones that we're involved in, and like some of the funding that Colorado Department of Agriculture and other initiatives have the potential to do, is de-risk the potential for producers to step in and be part of the solution related to use. We know that agriculture accounts for, and Kristen will have the more detailed statistics, 80% of the water use, roughly, in Colorado as one example. And we know, therefore, any solution related to water, carbon, environmental impact that neglects the role of agriculture is missing those who are going to be some of the most impacted and can have some of the deepest potential to have positive outcomes.
Great. Well, one of the reasons I like to focus on agriculture and soil is I think it's really interesting. So I'll just start there, that the sort of science and application of agricultural and soil science is fascinating to me. That is, I have a degree in soil science, so I'm a little bit biased, but I still think it's incredibly interesting. But in terms of this room, and I think one of the reasons why there's just an enormous opportunity in agriculture, both as a fraction of our GHG emissions, but also the potential to sequester carbon at low cost. There are many ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. We can go the completely technological route and put in a bunch of giant fans to capture air through DAC facilities. But there are some cheaper methods out there, and a lot of them run through agriculture. So that's a big part of the reason I'm interested in it. I think it also, in a lot of ways, democratizes the process as we implement carbon pricing strategies. A lot of the people that are going to be most affected are those that live in rural communities. I grew up in a small rural town. My parents drove everywhere, always, for everything, and there's a lot of gasoline consumption in small rural towns, and I think this presents a way, if we can get the financing right and get the pieces in place, there's a way to drive a lot of value back to rural communities who are going to be disproportionately affected by carbon pricing.
Thanks, guys. I think you covered most of what I was going to say. I'll just mention ag and forestry is, so much of our land is managed by private landowners, by private farmers and ranchers, and helping them figure out what's the best way to manage their land oftentimes they already know the best way to manage that land, but really incentivizing the right choices, I think, is really key. The kind of the individual choices and S-curve uptake of new technologies or new management practices is really key. It's like relatively easy to electrify a grid. It's a few decision makers versus the thousands and thousands of ranchers across the West who we have to figure out what drives their operation and what drives their decision making. So I think, like Myles said, it's very interesting. It takes, science and social science and being able to talk about cows and sagebrush, which I love. I also think, like Bill said, there's so many co-benefits of carbon sequestration in ag lands, which we're going to talk about later, but it's kind of a win-win-win operation. We can talk about capturing carbon, we can talk about lowering prices for farmers, and then also creating these ecosystem benefits.
Kristen, if I could just very quickly on
Yes.
that one, maybe just to make it really concrete, one example. So we had two producers that we worked with this year, a woman named Katie Preibel in Montana, a woman named Errol Greenwood in northern New Mexico. Both were facing similar challenges related to things like stock tank water monitoring. So Ariel's part of a group that manages a 125,000 acre ranch in northern New Mexico, right? Huge swaths of land. Katie's ranch is extremely large. The challenge of gassing up the tank, driving out to the stock tank, making sure that there's water available to water the cattle, making sure that there was the pump was working, right, to be able to pump the water, right? Think about just, the time associated with that, but also the carbon emissions associated with both the production of the water and the monitoring of the water. And so leaving it aside and eager to talk about a number of the soil health innovations and ideas that came forward, just knowing that those intensive inputs into just monitoring the health of the herd and making sure water was available across an extremely large rangeland, multiplied across multiple ranges across the West, you can start to see the potential role of solutions related to whether it be solar-powered monitoring or other ways to sort of tap into that ability to understand can save time, save diesel, save impacts in terms of carbon release. And so two interesting solutions that came from them that were helping them implement that we think other farmers and ranchers could benefit from.
Awesome. Myles, do you want to talk a little bit about some incentive-based programs you've seen around biochar production and use?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the biochar space, there are approved methodologies that can be used in the voluntary carbon markets. There are 4 different organizations that have approved methodologies for the production of biochar. One of them is led by an organization called Climate Action Reserve. That's a US-based program, but the rest are primarily European-based. Those have been used by many biochar producers, and actually one of the interesting things about biochar, and I still haven't put my finger on why this is the case, but in the carbon removal world, for sort of long durability carbon removal credits, all of the buzz right now is around technological solutions, things like direct air capture, carbon capture. But if you actually go look at which technologies are supplying the bulk of the actual carbon credits to date, something like 90% of the delivered carbon removal credits are biochar. So there's a lot of potential to increase that value. And so that's for just biochar, but there are also similar voluntary carbon credits for soil carbon. I'm not sure how widely used those are. I have heard concerns that the MRV, that is monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements associated with soil carbon credits, are pretty onerous. So they'd only really make sense for extremely large-scale projects. And also the price for a lot of those soil carbon-based credits is very low, like in the, $20 a ton of CO2e range, as compared to biochar, which is kind of in the $130 range, or DAC right now, which a lot of those facilities are currently getting $600 a ton per ton of CO2e. So there's just a vast difference in how much the market is willing to pay for these different types of credits. And then on kind of the incentive level, there are also a lot of programs. Currently, there's an NRCS conservation practice that will pay farmers to use biochar. There's very similar practices for lots of conservation practice standards for many other climate-smart agricultural practices. NRCS is a fairly cumbersome organization. And I say this, my wife worked there for 12 years, so I saw it for many years as a bystander. So, those dollars are real, but they're not fast. And then there are also some state programs that try to mimic NRCS. I know Washington State has some, and California has some programs. So that's the voluntary incentives that I know of.
If I could very quickly, because this is a place also where I do think philanthropy has a role to sort of prompt innovation and not just rely on the public dollar and the public sector. Because again, philanthropy, you're not putting the taxpayer dollar at risk. And so appreciate to be a part of that and look forward to engaging others in that conversation. But, specific to some of the challenges, when we sort of went to farmers and ranchers and had, said, tell us your best idea, tell us the way you might address a challenge, oftentimes we're looking for, how do we come alongside other dollars to extend a practice? And the challenges that I think the average producer faces in accessing things like EQIP funding or SIG funding out of NRCS are really substantial, huge barriers. And this is a place, as WGA has an important role, and the folks in this room have a role in engaging in the Farm Bill and engaging in USDA's ability to move money. Very difficult for, I think, your small farm or ranch to engage in accessing the public dollar. And so I think, when we sort of move forward, again, without some of those constraints that sit around that public taxpayer dollar, we invited ideas in, we made decision within 3 weeks, and we moved $535,000 out the door to help farmers and ranchers. And so I think that, when we think about the existing programs at the federal level, the incentives oftentimes don't match the experience of the farmers and ranchers. I'll give another example. We worked with a farmer outside of Lander, Wyoming, Melissa Hemken, on trying to secure some funding while she was also going after EQIP funding, but ran up against the barrier that her farm was not big enough to sort of hit the mark for the limited dollars that were available in Wyoming. And so a heavy input mono product farm with many more acres nearby was able to get that funding. She was not. And so, given that there is this trend to sort of go big or get out in agriculture, that has negative impacts in terms of the experience of small farms and the role of keeping farmland in farm production, to Kristen's point about the implications of that change, and the extent to which our public funding streams don't actually meet the needs of those who have difficulty navigating difficult markets and difficult public funding streams. And I also say biochar is another place where I think there could be more done here. We were fortunate to support 2 farmers. I thought I'd spring this on Myles. I didn't mention it and see his reaction in real time on the panel. We funded 2 biochar-related projects. One, Michael Lobato, a farmer on the West Slope in Colorado, who had an idea that oftentimes biochar can be spread across as a soil amendment. He was interested in this idea of what if we did subsurface injection of biochar, bumped up against the reality that there wasn't a product on the market to do that subsurface injection. And so we funded him to take a golf course aerator. I'm not a golfer, but pulling the plugs. And at the same time that you're plugging the golf course, inserting the biochar. And so testing the impact on that. And he's got some preliminary data that I think is really promising. The challenge, of course, is not a practice that he could get funded yet. And even some other funding streams that are asking farmers and ranchers to, in order to be eligible for funding, to actually quantify their savings. The tools that have been developed to do that don't always include biochar. And so another place where is there a role now for building that evidence base, but also pushing the public dollar to be more responsive to the small farmer and to have space for innovation, or space for proving out the practice as opposed to simply funding what we know works.
I want to add one more thing that came to my mind as far as voluntary sort of incentives. There's a growing movement. I'm not sure how legitimate this will become, but value chain emissions accounting. So there are now some big players in agriculture that are interested in paying farmers or incentivizing them in some way to use climate smart practices so that the GHG emissions associated with a different company's value chain are reduced. I've yet to see that represent as like a real funding stream for farmers, but I know it's out there and it's growing. So we'll see, hopefully that becomes a real funding stream.
And we've certainly seen interest in Colorado of supply chain partners, you know, mills and distillers, these kind of in-between folks be really interested in figuring out where their products is coming from, how they can reduce emissions in their value chain. So I agree, hasn't been built out quite yet, but I think it's an opportunity. And there's a lot of organizations and nonprofits and others trying to create kind of a certification around climate smart agriculture or regenerative agriculture or whatever you want to call it, agriculture. And it's a little bit of a battle of the labels right now, which I am concerned about, but I think it's a potential that I think our farmers could see, you know, real value from the market, private funding for doing some of these carbon sequestration practices. So we think that's a potential in Colorado. We've heard about federal funding, we've heard about philanthropic funding, heard about carbon markets. Just a quick plug for state funding, given that I work for a state. We at CDA we're very lucky. We got Governor Polis and our state legislature gave us ARP stimulus funding to really upstart our soil health program a couple years ago. And that was like no strings attached, do good work on soil health in the agricultural space, and that's what really started our soil health program. And that really allowed us to do innovative practices on properties and with farmers that have a hard time accessing that other kind of federal or government funding. Since then, we've gotten several federal grants, including a USDA Climate Smart Commodities grant, which was a great opportunity. But like one of our top goals there is us as the state will be the middleman between the federal rules and the farmers trying to implement the practices. So I think there's a real role for states in reducing some of the barriers for entry and like using that capacity and doing the bureaucracy and administrative support so that our producers don't have to deal with it. So yeah, our program right now is fully federally funded, but it is a goal of both Commissioner Greenberg, the Commissioner of Agriculture, and I think the Governor's office to figure out how to fund our program with more flexible state funding with support from the private sector, because I think a lot of producers, rightly so, don't want government subsidies. They're too much of a hassle and would much prefer to see the value that they're creating be valued in the supply chain. All right, I do want to turn to questions really quickly, but final question, and maybe Bill, you can start us off. How do we communicate some of these benefits, both carbon benefits and the water and ecosystem services and reduced pollution benefits to our farmers and ranchers?
Yeah, I think that so much of this is about meeting people where they are. And certainly we know ag producers are innovators, problem solvers, and want to be part of these larger conversations around whether it be water, whether it be climate, carbon, but the entry points are too narrow for your average farmer or rancher. And so I think, you know, for us, the entry point was truly, hey, do you have a water-related challenge that you'd like to try something else out to overcome? And again, de-risking this notion of taking on a challenge, taking on an innovation, and saying, let's use flexible funding. Ours philanthropic, but we know, can we leverage other dollars to help those farmers try something out? And so for many, it was certainly about how do I evolve to and adapt in the face of an aridification in the West? And I know that water scarcity is something I'm going to have to address sooner than later. Can dollars help me do that? Notably, and in an exciting way, learning along the way that there are these carbon related benefits. And I would say also, Kristen sort of gave you a very modest summary of the STAR program, which I think can be a real model for, again, meeting farmers where they are. If you're not familiar, it's a soil health assessment and monitoring and incentive-based payment that is voluntary, that is tied to sort of a rating scale around adoption of conservation practices. And so again, this idea of meeting people where they are and then getting dollars into the system that are more than the taxpayer dollar or just the philanthropic dollar. We were excited to see, in part due to the work of Colorado Department of Agriculture, this Climate Smart Commodities grant allow for the expansion of voluntary soil health practices to other states in the West. And so we also recently approved a grant to STAR, a national nonprofit that is bringing this voluntary soil health practice to Wyoming and to New Mexico. And again, the payers in that model don't just have to be philanthropy and don't just have to be the taxpayer dollar. We know that many of the buyers up and down the supply chain have carbon or environmental impact related goals. And so can those large procurement strategies that create incentives, whether it be everything from payments for the adoption of soil health practices that we know have carbon related benefits or water related benefits, as well as lenders. We are seeing innovative lenders, First Southwest Bank in Colorado, others that are creating favorable terms that make the adoption of these practices doable, workable, and in that producer's bottom line benefit. And again, that incentive-based structure kind of meets people where they are and de-risks the prospect of taking something on, and is good news for the buyer, good news for the lender who wants to de-risk their portfolio. If we know this farm can be in production and be profitable in a changing set of conditions in the West, that's a good lending bet for that producer, or that lender on behalf of that producer. So I think there are a number of ways that you can meet people, whether it be their bottom line need, preserve keeping the farm in production, as well as the desire to be part of these larger conversations around carbon, water in the West.
Yeah, I'll just say from the biochar perspective, at least communication with growers can be a challenge. You know, there are clearly early adopters out there that are interested in the climate benefits of agricultural practices. I would say the vast majority of growers are less interested in that. And so we try to, you know, typically focus on the other benefits, things like reducing water use, reducing nitrogen fertilizer consumption, sort of general soil health that have additional benefits. At the same time, you know, some of the folks most interested in climate smart practices that I've interacted with are some of the bigger players in the ag world. They tend to be the supply chain folks. They, I think, see the writing on the wall. You know, the interaction between those buyers and the growers right now, I think, is a little bit tense in that I think growers are feeling like they're getting these mandates pushed down upon them. So I'll just say that it's complicated and that it's challenging, and it's something that we try to focus a lot of our time and energy on, is trying to sort of advocate for the benefits of biochar and communicate those to growers. And we try our best to work with sort of good messengers like University Extension. So that's been our approach.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, is having the right partners be the right messengers. And often it's your local experts, your technical assistants from Extension or NRCS, or your neighbor. I think having the on-farm champions is really important. I could talk a lot about soil health and the STAR program, but I do want to open it up for questions. So please raise your hand.
Thanks. Todd Ontel from the U.S. Forest Service. I'm with our Office of Sustainability and Climate. And so this question is, I think, mostly for Myles. Biochar question. So you talked about the real large opportunity that there is for using mill waste, low-value material from fuel reduction treatments and forestry operations for biochar. And you also talked about, kind of from the perspective of incentivizing biochar, NRCS payment programs, for example, for growers to apply biochar to their operations. I'm just wondering about kind of the opposite, or the other end of thinking about incentivization for the production of biochar, because it's a cost, and from the Forest Service side of things, we have really been thinking about kind of what can change on the policy side of things for biochar production on our national forests, diverting that material that would have just been pile burned, turning it into biochar. But I'm thinking, what kind of policy ideas might there be, or incentives might there be for private landowners to engage in biochar production?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I'll start by pointing out the carbon credit value has really changed the biochar industry dramatically, and that only became available about 3 or 4 years ago. So those equate to something like $400, $300 to $400 per ton of biochar produced is the carbon removal value you can get. So there's some real value there. And then, what I was working, before I worked for the U.S. Biochar Initiative, I worked for a startup called Mino Carbon in Washington State. And one of the angles we saw pretty clearly was trying to ideally get something like a beneficial reuse or beneficial use tax credit for using things like slash. At least in the Pacific Northwest, there's just vast amounts of slash, and the standard practice is to torch it in giant burn piles. That does nobody any good. It gets rid of it, which is why it's done. But we were trying to advocate for sort of a beneficial use policy that would at least provide some amount of tax credit per ton of feedstock, because that would then obviously improve the economics of biochar, but it would also improve the economics of, we weren't trying to be practice specific here. We were just saying, hey, we would love to see a beneficial use for slash. So I think those are some of the incentives that are probably available. On the Forest Service side, I would love to see a value for kind of like what that value looks like for Forest Service. Like what's the beneficial use value to Forest Service? I haven't ever seen that put in a document anywhere, and I'm not sure if anybody has that value, but that would be extremely helpful to know.
Yeah, so we had Secretary Vilsack had the Secretary's memo from July 2022 that directed the Forest Service to think of new policy measures that we could take to incentivize, carbon stewardship and climate resilience. And so I worked with a group from state, private, and tribal forestry, and also from the Forest Products Lab to really think through these questions. And that was something that we spent a lot of time thinking about, putting a value on that material and to avoid those emissions from pile burning, essentially. So it is something that I think we're moving forward on those policy recommendations to the Secretary's office.
That's great.
Thank you. Seth Snyder, Idaho National Lab. I was going to ask a question for Myles, but it was too close to that, so I'm going to ask a question to Bill. You spoke a lot about water. The real competition in water is between ag and power plant cooling and other sorts of industrial cooling. Do you see how you can kind of build a relationship with small farms and basically local power plants, local industrial uses to get a fair use of water and benefit the communities?
Yeah, would welcome others who have insights on that. I would say that the urgency over the conversation around water use, the role of agriculture, the role of growth in our cities, and the use of water in things like power production. In Colorado and beyond, the urgency as driven by aridification are going to require some way to build those bridges. I would say for us as a philanthropic funder who's focused on small communities throughout the Mountain West and the role of agriculture in that, in supporting those communities is sort of our starting point, and want to build from there, but be open to ideas in this room and beyond on how we help build those bridges so that tension does not undermine either sector's impact.
And I'll just add quickly, like Bill said earlier, ag uses a huge amount of water, uses about 80% of the state of Colorado's water. And we've found, we've seen a lot of buy and dry in our state of mostly residential areas buying water rights from willing farmer sellers, but removing it from the ag sector and using it instead in suburban growth. That probably has happened for industry too. And we're really thinking, how do we have these more flexible agreements, collaborative water sharing agreements, where some years the farmer can use it, some years the cities or the industry can use it, and it requires a lot of flexibility that neither of those sectors is used to, but we've seen it play out pretty successfully in a few cases. So we're hoping, especially as we have less and less water, or at least with climate change, more fluctuation of water resources, we can think about that sharing of water and figuring out how do we, in great years, have water for everybody, and in the really tough years, have water for drinking.
Thank you. I'm on this microphone probably too much today. I'm Curtis Martin. I'm an Eastern Oregon rancher. I've been there my entire life, and this is really some great information. And Kristen, I got to tell you, I'm going to push some love back to you when you said that you love sagebrush and bunchgrass, because that's where I live in the high desert of Oregon. So appreciate that comment.
Yeah, sage-grassy.
Not very many people know that country, but that's my heritage, and I'm really proud of it, and I want to sustain it. So I think your question earlier was kind of directed, how do you invigorate or cause the questions from the ag producers like myself to be involved in this? And I guess I would relate that there's a real awareness of most ranchers and farmers that we have to connect with our urban and metropolitan counterparts, because we're less than 1.5% of society now. And I really do want, it may sound kind of weird, but I want my city cousins, I guess for lack of a better word, to know me, because I think if they can come out and see what I'm doing as far as conservation enhancements for riparian building and carbon sequestration, we're embarking on some really intensive research with Oregon State University professors trying to put forward the holistic the cattle industry. It's, the greenhouse gas, the UN accusation that cattle are producing 3 to 5% of the greenhouse gases in certain segments could be true, but you've got to take the holistic approach of cow-calf operations when the majority of their life are spent out on the open range, and it actually invigorates carbon sequestration. So, I'm palavering here too much, and I don't want bear down too much on it, but there is there's many organizations that are producer or organizations that are wanting to pursue, getting legitimate science and initiatives out on the landscape so that we can tell our story. And it's not a story, it's the truth, and that's what we're after. And so really appreciate what your comments are. I work very closely with the NRCS, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and these are great organizations that really put the technology on the ground where it really matters. And one question I had with Myles is on the biochar. So I'm involved in a lot of things. I don't know how many here would be aware of the Sage Grouse Initiative, which is a huge deal for the bird, and I actually have core habitat on my properties in Eastern Oregon. So with that, I do a lot of juniper cutting and eradication, and I've often thought if there was a way that I could get that off the landscape once it is cut, but I don't know whether it's plausible or not because it's very tough country. So, I'd be really interested in pursuing that possibility. And then, Bill, your organization is huge. We're trying to get local meat processing in Baker Valley. That's where I live, and we have the best raw product in the world, and we're looking at biodigesters for the meat processing waste that would include food waste or any kind of organic waste that could be totally carbon, actually negative is what we're looking at. So I guess I don't have any questions, but the biochar is very intriguing to me. And Kristen, I just want to applaud what you said, because I wish maybe, I don't know how many producers there are in this room, but they are invigorated. The problem is, it's such a tough lifestyle that they don't have time to come to these great things like this is. I'm semi-retired, so I can goof around quite a bit. But what you're doing is really really worthwhile. And building those bridges between the urban, rural, especially in Oregon, there's maybe a greater divide in Oregon than there is in Idaho. But anyway, I appreciate that very much.
Thanks, Curtis. I appreciate the compliments. And yeah, I think we all totally agree the kind of communication of the many benefits our producers are creating is really key. And I apologize, we didn't mean to talk about all sorts of co-benefits, but we ran out of time. And I think we're out of time. So Jack, over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Kristen and panelists,